A very good evening to you, and thank you so much for joining us on this edition of Spectrum Extra, live on Radio 1 FM 90. We are broadcasting from the Central Building in the heart of our city, Kampala. We're live on our website, which is www.radio1fm90.com. You click on the icon with the word Listen Live. Now, you can find this radio station also on the different radio listening apps. Those you can obtain from the apps of your smartphone. You look for any of those radio listening apps, download, look for Radio 1 FM 90, and as long as you have an internet connection, you should be able to listen to us from anywhere across the globe. Today being a Friday, we normally review the major events of the week, but today we decided to do a special discussion about Uganda's 63 years of independence. And yes, Uganda is 63 years old. That milestone was reached yesterday. This is an opportunity for us to evaluate the journey that this country has gone through. Now, of course, when you read, they will tell you that in our history, we have had trouble in the past. You'll find where they will tell you there has been a liberation phase. And then people will tell you there's an era of transformation. So our commemoration, like I said, took place yesterday at Kololo Airstrip. The theme was 63 years of independence, a reason to double our efforts in sustaining a united, progressive nation. Sustaining a united, progressive nation. Now, President Yoweri Museveni was led this country for the largest share of the 63 years, that's about 40 years, told off those who think they can delay this country. He actually used the word Uganda is unstoppable. That's in terms of governance, in terms of development, and security, which is one of the key issues he talked about. But what do the 63 years actually mean for a country that has gone through the different phases? Now, given this reality, I assembled a team to share with us, looking into our history. We have a historian here who will explain to us the troubled past and whether we have actually learned our lessons from that troubled past that we normally talk about. And that is none other than Dr. Robert Ojambo, who is a senior lecturer and head of the History Department, Archaeology and Heritage at Kyambogo University. He's also a political analyst. Good evening. It's a pleasure having you on Spectrum Extra, Dr. Ojambo.
Good evening, Kenneth, and good evening, listeners.
Also in studio, we have someone who cuts across. He's partly witnessed independence, but also later on took part in addressing some of the mistakes that happened in the past. But the question is, that process they went through of constitutional making, did it actually address the challenges that this country was facing in the past? Mark you, we marked 30 years of our constitution just on Thursday, since the 1995 constitution was promulgated. And that person is the Honorable John Eresu. He's a former Kabaramaido County MP, and he was a member of the Constituency Assembly. Good evening, Honorable Eresu. Always a pleasure having you on this platform.
Thank you very much, Kenny. Good evening, listeners.
Now in studio, we have a Gen Z, somebody who does not want to hear about your troubled history, who doesn't want to hear where they found us in 1986. He's thinking about Uganda going forward. And that's none other than Mr. Andrew Karamaji. He's a lawyer, pundit on governance and human rights issues. Good evening, Mr. Karamaji. It's a pleasure having you on Spectrum Extra.
Pleasure being here. I'm a big fan of the show. Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for listening to us, even afar where you're based. It's a pleasure having you on the show. Lastly but not least, we have an analyst who is able to read between all the history, the transformation, and all these kind of things, and predict to us where we are going. And that's none other than Mr. Timothy Chimonges. He's Executive Director at the Parliamentary Watch and the Center for Policy Analysis. Good evening. It's a pleasure having you on Spectrum Extra.
Thank you, Kenneth. Good evening to the panelists here, and good evening to the listeners. I'm glad to be here.
But also, most important, we have you, the listener, who is part of this discussion, and do share with us your view via the WhatsApp line 0703-090-090. Remember, your comments, questions help to shape the discussion that goes on in studio. Now, let's begin with our history, and I want to go to Dr. Ojambo. Dr. Ojambo, Uganda is 63 years old. When you hear some people talking, they will talk about our troubled past and how we need to learn from it. We have so many young people in this country. Some of them may be not aware of that troublesome past. When we talk about our troubled past, what exactly are we talking about?
Kenneth, thank you For us in history, we say history does not lie. And therefore saying that Uganda is 63 years is a lie. Uganda has been here. But it depends on which type of Uganda are you talking about. Are you talking about Uganda, the independent one, or the supposedly independent one? Are you talking about Uganda, the protectorate? Are you talking about Uganda, which was a society before the colonialists put it together and pronounced Buganda badly and called it Uganda? So you need to first answer those questions before you go up with this jargon, Uganda at 63. You must add something there. Uganda is a very unique country, like all African countries are. Before colonialism came here, each society was living on their own. And they could only meet with other societies on trade ventures, on war of expansion ventures, or just general expeditions. For example, Bunyoro was living as a society of Banyoro. Nkole and many others down there were also living there. Buganda was living here. In fact, even Buganda becomes pronounced so much in the 15th century. But before the 15th century, there was also nothing Buganda. So our history, in most cases, has been limited to very small period of time. And sometimes even worse. Some people even want to reduce it to 1986. But Ugandans and the people who make up the country that later became Uganda in 1894, then completed that agenda in 1926, and later 1962, as you would want to call it, has been a society which has been here for some time. And you find each community in this country are somehow unique in the way they do things. They speak different languages, or what you would call different customs. They had different approach to things, on how they organized themselves. You find the Baganda in Buganda who had a king. The Karamojongs were living under their individual clan leaders, and so on and so forth, up to a very long time. In fact, the last society to put in Uganda were the Karamojong in 1926. So for that matter, we are limiting our discussion to when Uganda got, I don't normally want to call it independence, but probably self-rule using the European model. They got what they called self-rule, but using the European model, where they only put in a few of their some of the characteristics of the things that they had, but they adopted the European model, where now you had a flag, you had an emblem, you had a national anthem, you had the constitution, and many other things. Of course, some societies had a semblance of those things, but they were not very, very pronounced as it was. So since that time, you need to look at the period that preceded the independence. Would inform you the problems that, or the achievements that this country later called Uganda came to pass through. And I will just look at 1952 to 1962. Those 10 years are very, very important in laying a foundation for this country called Uganda. Of course, at first, the colonialists had been here for a very long time, from 1879 officially, but they had been unofficially here for a longer period of time because they would come in and get out. But from 1894 to 1962, there was a period when there was some struggle to get independence. And this began by societies arguing that they wanted to do their things in their own ways. For example, you remember the Bataka fights in Buganda in the 1930s to 1945, where the Bataka were saying, we are the custodians of the land. How come that at this time the British and their allies, the chiefs, have taken over our land? So that grew up, and later came people like Augustine Kamia, then later Musazi, And Musazi, that group is the one which began the Uganda National Congress. The Uganda National Congress in 1952 starts with the simple things, and that's why you do. I would like viewers there to look at. Don't take anything simple. These were just the people who are saying, we want to live in our town, Kampala, and trade in it like Baganda, like local people. And at that time, Kampala was divided into three. There was a Kampala of civil servants, Kampala of the colonialists, and the Kampala of the common man. In Katwe down there, they used to call it Chibuga Chabadugavu. So they started saying, we need to trade on our own terms. We don't want these terms that we bring our coffee, bring our cotton, we bring our produce and other things, and we are given terms by these colonialists. And they started as if they wanted that thing. The other thing, they wanted to be free in making their own decisions. So from there, of course, in 1954, the Uganda National Congress breaks into a number of factions, and one of the bigger factions becomes Uganda People's Congress. UPC. Immediately after a few years, I think another 2 years, the Democratic Party came. And normally also the history given about the Democratic Party depends on who is talking about it. If it is to belittle it, they say it was a Catholic thing which was fighting for the rights of the Catholics. That group will be those who want to belittle it. And then, of course, when the colonialists reached that time, they realized the burden of colonialism. It had become very difficult because some countries were really struggling. There had been the Mau Mau in Kenya. There had been a lot of struggle in South Africa, in Algeria, and in many places. So it was agreed that we need to start leaving these people to govern themselves. For example, in Uganda here, there was not much fights. There were a few struggles here, and people like Musazi were deported, both in Uganda and in outside Uganda. So, to cut the long story, we came into the process of preparing Uganda for independence, and this was the most delicate time. And at that time, we had a huge divide in Uganda, and which has continued to affect us up to today. There was this strong kingdom called Buganda and the rest of Uganda. The strong kingdom wanted to get independence as a kingdom, and that's why you saw for them, they celebrated their independence on 8th. This month on 8th, they were celebrating, and they wanted to achieve freedom as the kingdom of Buganda. And that's what is normally pronounced by other people as Federo. So they demanded for Federo. So at first, there was a conflict on how do you get delegates to go to Lancaster. The general thing was that each district and political parties and groups elect delegates to the Lancaster conference. Buganda said no. For us, we want our delegates to be selected by Buganda. And they wanted a bigger number. They said you cannot give us the same delegates as Lango, as Bukedi, as Acholi. So that was sorted out, and I liked the people who were nursing the whole thing, babysitting this whole thing. So they agreed, and later they did it as Buganda deemed it. Buganda selected their people, and each district sent a representative, and that time I think we had about 16 districts, 16 only. We didn't have this 146. So, and those districts were not in the geography that we know them. Lango was a district, Bunyoro was a district, Ankole was a district, and so on and so forth. So when these people went to Lancaster, there was a serious argument on how Uganda would look like. The kingdom people, led by Buganda, argued they wanted Uganda to be a federal state, where each kingdom is a state on its own, and it federates with other states, and they form a country called Uganda. There was a group of people, especially most of the elite who had studied and had looked at the impact of federated states or federal and this kingdom thing, they said for us we wanted a republic. One time, Okot Bitek, who is one of the celebrated novelists, was asked, because at that time he was a student in London, and was asked about this constitution, which was being made in Lancaster, and he described it in the following words, that the thing is being treated like a sack of eggs. You pack eggs in a sack, and you are trying to carry them. And here I'm talking about raw eggs. So you have to be very careful. Anytime the discussion would break. So they had to treat Uganda almost like a baby. Whenever there was any problem, they would say, okay, we have accepted. And that's why the constitution comes up, 1962 constitution comes up, and it is a very delicate constitution. Yeah. It has two types of government in one country. Those who wanted federal, take your kingdoms. Those who want the republic, take your republic. In fact, they did not even finish the matter of governance. They said governance matter, the leader of Uganda will be determined in 1963. And there was also another thorny issue of the lost counties, which had been taken by Buganda from Bunyoro. They said that one will be sorted out in 1964. I think those were the major issues, the two, which bring us problems. So we say, okay, let's give birth to the baby, we shall see what happens. So the baby is born, but with the two bonds, the lost county issues and the issue of governance. Who governs the country? So in simple terms, they said, in the first instance, we are going to have a prime minister who will be the executive leader, and then the others will follow. So when they came here, they agreed that they needed a president. But remember, with this kingdom, I would call it a kingdom thing, kingdom sort of, these people who take alcohol, the problem they suffer from, what is it called? You wake up in the morning, you took a lot of alcohol. Hangover. With this kingdom hangover. In 1963, it was agreed that the parliament selects from one of the kings of Uganda to become the president. And the candidates were His Highness Sir Edward Mutesa and His Highness, of course they had stopped them to call themselves their Majesty, because the Majesty was the Queen. So they were called their Highness, Nadiope. Something happened, because you remember, to defeat DP, UPC had made an alliance. UPC supported Buganda, and the king became, being the president, became Mutesa, and Nadiope became the vice president. In fact, some people have been complaining about vice presidents in Uganda. The thing started then. Nadiope was a vice president who did not have almost anything to say. Sometimes people would find him in Jinja and they ask him, Sebo, Kampala. There is a meeting in Kampala. And he would say, I was not informed. he did not know. And that started us with a bad note. And now quickly running through. In 1964, we go to touch the thing, the lost counties. And this is where the problem between the central government, the marriage of convenience between UPC and the KY shows up to now. So the prime minister is for a referendum. The king does not support a referendum. The parliament votes for a referendum. The king and his people start seeing how they can win this referendum. And this is information you can go and find out. These problems of election, that's when they begin. The king and his people start ferrying people from Buganda to take them to Bunyoro. There was a scheme called the Ndaiga scheme, and its purpose was to take people there so that they can go and defeat Bunyoro. But Bunyoro were determined. They were speaking Lunyoro. Some of them had even changed their names. They were called Chiwanuka. But when it came to voting, of course, there were many counties the two counties of Buyaga and Bugangaizi managed to vote to come to Buekula, and others did not. And because of that, that became the departure between the Prime Minister and his darling friend, the Kabaka Edward Mutesa, that culminates into the 1966 crisis, and the 1966 crisis has pushed us up to where we are today.
Spectrum Extra on Radio 1 FM 90.
The man has written
Deep.
Thank you, sir.
Deep revelations there, including one thing I'm learning for the first time, that the British mispronounced the name Buganda, and they started calling probably somebody was wondering. I say we are a Bantu-speaking country, and you would want to find the exact meaning of the word Uganda, and you look left, right, and center, you may not find it. But now we are learning from history what exactly happened. Now, having heard from that historical perspective, we are now going to open into the future. But first, let's go for a break. Stay tuned, Radio 1 FM 90. Keep your comments coming via the WhatsApp line 0703 090 090. Well, thank you so much for staying with us on Spectrum Extra live on Radio 1 FM 90. Our special focus on our third independence anniversary with Dr. Robert Ojambo, senior lecturer and head of the History Department, Archaeology and Heritage at Kyambogo University. Mr. Timothy Chemonges, Executive Director, Parliamentary Watch and the Center for Policy Analysis. Mr. Andrew Karamaji, lawyer and pundit on governance and human rights issues. And the Honorable John Eresu, former Kabarmaido County MP, and he was a member of the Constituency Assembly. Now, gentlemen, we have heard from the history. Now, let's jump into this discussion, trying to look into the future. So, that troubled past, according to Dr. Jambo, provided the foundation of the so many challenges that we even face today. But there was an opportunity in 1986 when the NRM came into power after that protracted Bush war. They came in with a promise of fundamental change. One of the things they did was actually to come up with a constitution, which has, been around now for 30 years. Now, one of the people who actually was part of the constitution-making process is Honorable John Eresu. Now, we want to hear from you. Through the constitutional process, you were given an opportunity to address all the challenges that Dr. Jambo talks about, to set the legal framework for governing this country, to settle the political issues, the human rights issues, and so many issues that are contained in this particular constitution. Now, we want to hear from you. Having been part of that constitutional body, do you think you did a credible job?
Before I answer that question, Kenny, probably Dr. Jambo should have continued to bring us up to the level where the Constituent Assembly had been called, because there were so many other events which happened, and they were very profound, such that they provided the reason for the Constituent Assembly to come to play. But since you have now told me, let me try to go back a little, and then we see how we can connect to when the Constituent Assembly came. First of all, I want to thank Dr. Jambo and the panelists here for being together. But should I first say, the other things, like we discussed it after when we were in the break, that the Constitution of 1962, like Dr. Jambo said, Okot Bitek had put it, was like raw eggs in a bag, in a sack. Was really a delicate constitution. And it was a constitution which was bound to create problems for this country. There's an article in the Constitution of 1962. I have a copy, I have it at home. And I keep reading it all the time and wondering really who wrote the Constitution. It had a lot of, articles which in the end directed the country, made the country appear that it would end up in problems. There was an article which reads, I think it's Article 64, which says that any act passed by Parliament must be assented to by the President to become law. In the event that the President doesn't assign, the Prime Minister can sign, and it will be taken as an act of the President. And therefore it means it will become law. Now, given the situation of the referendum, which Sir Edward Mutesa declined to assent to become law, Prime Minister Obote signed it. And when Obote signed it, it became law. The Buganda Lukiko sat. When Buganga Lukiko sat, they gave an ultimatum to the central government to remove the capital from Kampala. By the way, that aspect alone forms the basis of what Kampala is today, even in the new in other constitutions thereafter. For example, Kampala is not considered in the constitution as part of Uganda. I'm sure we agree with that.
Yes.
And it came as a result of that incident. That has been adopted all through in any constitution which came after 1962 constitution. So that is a very important thing to note. Then secondly, because of the break between Uganda and the central government and leading to a crisis which was very unfortunate, we must say that at the end of the day, Uganda started fighting itself.
Is that the 1966 crisis?
Culminating to the 1966 crisis. But there were so many other events in between, which if Professor Jambo, Dr. Jambo had continued, probably would have been very clear. I read history, but I read that thing not as a student, but as a point of interest.
You can just tell us what happened in 1966. What exactly
For
happened?
example, after that incident of signing the act on behalf of the president, which was King Freddy, it means, as Dr. Jambo put it, a referendum had to be held. And the referendum was being fluked by fake registrations of Baganda transferred to Bunyoro to vote so that the referendum comes in favor of Buganda, and it was discovered. It therefore meant the efforts of Buganda was destroyed, and therefore the animosity between the two people, the prime minister on one side and the president on the other, increased, culminating into a conflict. But this was what happened. The commander-in-chief of the Uganda army at that time was King Freddy. And it is reported that King Freddy sent a telegram to the Queen requesting for military assistance. I read it. And I read this thing in 1975, when I was a student at the University in Dar es Salaam, from the library. And the Queen declined. And when the Queen declined, this matter also leaked to the central government. So the question now became that the army itself was getting divided. The commander of the army then was someone called Brigadier Polot. Now, Brigadier Polot was the obedient commander to his commander-in-chief, who was the Kabaka. So Obote, on the other hand, finds himself empty because now he had to look for someone in the army that should be for him. Hence the rise of Idi Amin. Do you get the point?
We get the point.
So at the end of the day, they collided, and therefore Lubiri was hit. By who? By Amin. But the other interesting thing in my reading was that neither Obote nor Amin expected the escalation of that thing to reach a level where it would have caused big destruction. They thought it was a simple military operation which would end ordinarily. In fact, according to them, they said they had gone to check Lubiri because there was suspicion that there were ammunitions in that place. As a result of the telegram that they have got, they thought that perhaps there are some ammunition in Lubiri. So on reaching there, I think the few guards who were there fired, and therefore things took off in a different direction. And that was all. In other words, they did not know the magnitude of what they were dealing with and how much it would escalate to.
All right.
Hence, the country has taken a different trajectory from that time up to now.
Not to interrupt him, but
all right. Now let's come to you, the young generation, Andrew Karamaji. You hear this history and you look at where Uganda is now. Have we learned any lessons?
So, just to lead off of where he left off, where the honorable member left off, younger Ugandans like myself might think he was describing Kasese 2015. Because if you simply follow the events as he has narrated them, there's almost no distinction between that invasion of the Lubiri then and what happened in Rwenzururu, although we know those are two different incidents. But it's interesting to see how the parallels that can be drawn between both, right? Then, before I get into my submission, also a question that I have for the historian here, Dr. Ojambo. What is it about this Prime Minister-President fight? Because it's not limited to Uganda. You are aware of what happened in Zaire, now DRC, Democratic Republic of the Congo, between, I think, Moise Shombe, Patrice Lumumba, and that kind of fight has continued. To this day, you still have similar fights in Senegal between the president and the prime minister. What is it? Is there something a pattern we are missing, that we are not seeing about this question? Is it a defective design? Is there a conspiracy therein that we're not aware of? What could be happening insofar as those two positions are concerned? So, thank you for the question. I want to use a strange analogy to make my intervention. And that strange analogy is an analogy of my mother, who is a few months older or younger than the country we call Uganda. And so you can plot a graph for the mathematicians between her life, which has been, I could say, a successful one, born when the country was born, went to school, achieved certain milestones that we consider to be important as humans, got a job, got into a marriage, got children, has raised them successfully, is now a senior citizen, is retired, and has lived a life that you could say, this is a life worth living, a life well lived.
Fulfilling.
Yes, a fulfilled life. And so if we plot a similar curve of Uganda, if the two were children born at the same time, would we arrive at the same conclusion in terms of a fulfilled life? Because let me say, this sister of hers has gone through conflict, has gone through all the kinds of things that we've talked about here: ethnic animosity, political instability, economic doldrums, and so on, up to this point. I certainly was not around even during these constitutions, the 4 successive constitutions we're discussing. So the benefit of analysis for me is grounded in those unique experiences we had. Let me turn to something that our host introduced this program with regarding the question of security, coming off the speech of General Yoweri Museveni at the celebrations. And he talked about security. Security is such a serious term, a serious word to use, however you look at it. My spot of bother is that we now have a conflation, and you can see this throughout the fabric of our country's history, a conflation of regime security or political party security, national security, state security, all rolled into one, meaning the same thing. So that when that palace was invaded, was it a national security question? Was it a state security question? Or was it a regime security question? That is something we've not been able to resolve up to today. And with the current fusion of the ruling party to the Ugandan state, the question is even all the more complex, because all these things are intertwined. The other opening I'd like to make is how the quality of life, it's a very unfortunate discussion that you hear in Zimbabwe, where I live, that you hear in Nigeria, all these former colonies, African colonies, where people are beginning to ask questions like, was it, the fact that, whether the question is wrong or right, the fact that people can ask, were we better off under colonial rule, or now that we are supposedly independent or managing ourselves? I think it's a very unfortunate and painful question that people can raise such a question about their existence in what we supposedly call a new African state. And reading from previous constitutions, the current one, it's apparent that we've not resolved the question of nationhood. I think that distinction is important between the geographical expression, which can be a country, nationhood, which is a bit more of a complex entity, and then the state, which is the hardware. So we've excelled at hardware questions. We have the means of coercion. We have this geographical expression that's known in the international community. Have we built a state? I think not. Have we built a nation? I think not. Yeah.
And my question was, looking at the history that was provided on this table by the two gentlemen, have we learnt our lessons?
History does not lie, as Dr. Jambo said. It's sad that we are repeating. As I began to say, the narration of what happened at that palace in Buganda is not different from what we've seen happening at another palace or even other palaces in this country. We had a general ban down cultural sites in Tesoland. We had an attack on the Renzururu Palace. So a number of these lessons, if I were to give a score, have actually not been learned. We still repeat the same things, and I can see us, sadly, if you follow the trajectory of where we've been before, I do not see that we have learnt the lessons. And sadly, we are supposedly a more informed, more exposed, more technologically advanced group of people, but acting so terribly different from those before. I listen to elders talking about the nostalgia of cities like Jinja, Mbale, which are organized and built along grids, where the planning for stormwater, drainage, housing, industrial complexes, land use and management, education policy, healthcare, where there were master plans that were being followed. But today, the entire country has a headache over one channel, one drainage channel, not too far from where we are having this discussion from. So sadly, we've not learned lessons.
All right. Let's now go to Mr. Timothy Chemonges. Mr. Timothy Chemonges, you've sat in, listened in to the different panelists who have submitted on this particular issue. Let's hear your take, history and the present.
Thank you, Anderson. I should start by thanking Dr. Jambo and Honorable Iresu here for the very extensive and elaborate history. For me, I'm a student of history, and every time I get to listen but also read history, it amazes me. And listening to the two distinguished gentlemen, and listening to what President Museveni says and talks about the art teachers and those who are in the art industry.
Science and teachers. Science teachers and the arts teachers.
It places me in a very interesting place because I think our country stands in a place to enjoy more in what history provides. Of course, science, the scientists really play a critical role, but looking at our history, looking at the opportunities that we are likely to derive from this, for me, it's quite critical. The other is, for me, again, I should agree with Honorable Dr. Ojambo to say that as a country we did acquire sovereignty, but the question of self-independence or self-determination still remains to be a big issue. Looking at the challenges that we are facing at the independence, as indicated, there were three key major issues that the country was facing. And I think as of the independence, the country worked towards and promised to work towards too. The first is the question of poverty. The second one is around the question of illiteracy. And the third around the question of health, which is disease predominantly. And if you assess where we are at as far as progress of these three components is concerned, you see that there's quite a lot that is desirable. Of course, there's a bigger and broader question of governance, as indicated. And probably what we are facing today is has a lot to do with what our history provides, and probably should provide us with an opportunity to read and pick some lessons from what history provides. Again, when you look at things happening today, I think that we're still within the precepts of colonialism, but with some sense of independence. So if you stretch this to economics and what our economic status looks like, we are in a semblance of colonialism which has been repackaged to an economic colonialism. Again, I don't know if that's an area that we'll be discussing, but for me, I see the question of governance has metamorphosized itself properly and put us again in a very proper conundrum of colonialism at economic status. And again, I think the economists have a better perspective to this when you look at our economics, look at our debt question, but also look at how we've responded to the economic questions of the day. Today, when you look at our budget, we literally are able to finance locally less than 40% of our total budget. The rest would be externally financed and other sources, definitely. And that speaks to the broader question of governance. We still have the three areas as envisioned, that probably once we've addressed the question of health, once we've addressed the question of poverty among our people, and probably addressed the question of education, the realization of what independence will look like is a true reflection in those three areas. And so I think that we still have a long way to go. If you look at how we've governed ourselves, using the legal framework as provided for, or even as created by ourselves. Dr. Jambo earlier was giving perspective towards, we've had the 4 constitutions, and each of these constitutions has had a thinking and a strategy behind it. The Independence Constitution, clearly that was not our legal framework. It is a document and a framework that was handed to us. As again indicated, the 1967 Constitution, a document of power, a document of struggle, of dominance between ourselves. And lastly, the 1995 Constitution, which we've defiled, but also worked to protect power as opposed to working for the people. And so there's still a lot to be desired. And for me, listening to the gentlemen around here, it gives me a sense that we still have a long way to go.
All right. All right. Now I want to go to Mr. Eresu, and then I'll come to Dr. Jambo. And Mr. Eresu, you heard from Mr. Chimonges there actually hinting on the current constitution. You were one of the framers of that constitution, and that constitution was supposed to solve so many problems that we faced in the past, and also push this country into a new direction. When you make your assessment now, 30 years later, and this kind of situation we are in now, Mr. Chimonge is suggesting that there's some sort of colonial setup when you look at the economy and the number of other issues. He actually talks about the constitution, how it has suddenly shifted to protecting power as in opposed to serving the people. What would you say?
I would want to say like this. All constitutions have a purpose. The 1995 Constitution was enacted against the backdrop of the problems Uganda had gone through, whose solutions seemingly were not coming to an end and had been thought that could be resolved through a new kind of treaty. That's why the preamble of the Constitution speaks the way it does. And for any constitution to operate, there are two things one cardinal thing which must be there is goodwill. The goodwill of those who take over leadership of a country based on the dictates of the Constitution, and also the willingness of the people to accept that leadership so that the treaty operates properly. I can say this. By the time when the 1995 Constitution was promulgated, there was a lot of goodwill. Everybody was happy that at least we had come to a point where the country was getting reborn. And we had started a new journey to prosperity. But there were two things. One was the economic base on which this constitution stood. Uganda had that time been a country which had been devastated economically. You remember the Amin regime had brought in what they call economic war. By the time this country was liberated by the UNLF, when Amin was removed, and so on and so forth, and many others which came thereafter, our economic base was very narrow. Actually, by the time Amin left, the GDP growth in this country was negative 3%. In other words, we were doing, instead of growing, we were moving backwards by the rate of 3%. So the most important thing to be done was that the country must find a footing to create a welfare state, a welfare situation that can pick up the economy. And what happened was that we did not have resources. If we had them, there was no way to handle them to the benefit of the people. Hence, the IMF and World Bank recommendations kick in. And that is how privatization came into being. And the recommendations of the World Bank and the IMF is what we hold majorly up to this day. And we can see that privatization in itself actually brought in a situation where the local and indigenous economy became totally crushed.
Yeah.
This is one problem we must know. So that even if the constitution was as good, the welfare of the people to own and the productive forces and own means of production and get the benefit of their production was against the backdrop of a recommendation which would not really work in their interest. For example, the liberalization policy, which put us directly into a market level with, say, a developed country, adversely worked against us. For example, you could not, for example, take your potatoes to sell in France and expect it to sell because they had a better one for themselves. Mind you, when it came to the World Bank and IMF recommendations, the Western Europe and actually the Western world economy was collapsing. And this thing helped them to pick up. The early 90s, they helped them to pick up against the backdrop of our poverty. It did not help us. And that is what has perpetuated itself to this day. All these industries that you see, some of them do not have any concrete meaning to our local economy. But we call them our industries. So that alone means our poverty in the rural areas can perpetuate itself.
I think, Anderson, the crime scene is a lot bigger.
Are you getting me?
Yeah.
So,
sorry, just to compliment you.
yes, please.
The crime scene is a lot bigger than you've described. You've talked about privatization,
Yeah.
which, to cause neoliberalism, what you're describing, has three elements: privatization, deregulation,
Yes,
and liberalization.
Liberalization, yes.
The sheer impact of those three things on our nascent economies, the force that the imposition of currency controls, devaluing our currencies,
Devaluation and so on. yeah.
which affected our ability to industrialize, to grow our export base and so on, those things disabled the local economy in such a way that we were not able then to have an economic base on which to build a functional democracy.
Yeah.
The simple point I want to make in complimenting him is that it then becomes incompatible. Unregulated capitalism is incompatible with a democratic experiment, and that's something that we're struggling with, which I hope the listeners can engage.
And I
with.
can
Yeah.
say this for the moment, that for any economic development, and I'm talking as an economist, that's my field of training, there is nothing like a free market in actual sense anywhere in the world. There is nothing like that. In actual life, there is no free market. Because when you think about a free market, it's a theory. And that theory is called the price theory.
Yes.
And the price theory is a theory. That means it is a theory because it cannot be practically applied.
Yes.
So to plan closer to it is economic disaster. We talk of the US as a liberal market, but you look at the kind of tariffs they are being imposed, they are imposing on other countries. That is already a clear indication that there is no free market.
There's no free market.
It's not true. Yeah.
Yeah.
When the French potato growers get into problems, they block all roads with tractors
And force the government to intervene.
government to intervene.
Yeah.
That means there is no free market in the trade of potatoes.
Potatoes.
Why should we plan alongside a free market?
All right, Spectrum
But now,
already on FM 90. We need to go for this break. When we return, we'll continue looking into the realities that Honorable John Ereso has put across as we build into the next years going forward for Uganda. Are we building towards a better nation? Are we sustaining the gains that we have made? Are we risking them? Stay tuned to Radio 1 FM 90. Keep your comments coming by the WhatsApp line 0703-090. When we return, I'll sample some of those comments and they will help us into our next phase of discussion. Well, we're glad that you're still with us on Spectrum Extra live on Radio 1 FM 90. This is a special edition looking at the 63 years of our country. We are looking at the gains and the challenges, and we are also trying to see where we are headed to as a country. 63 years, that's a grandpa, if I might say, grandmom.
Yes.
The responsibility that comes with that is that country actually playing that grandpa role, taking care of the people. And surprisingly, we were having a discussion during the break.
63 is just a baby.
It's just a baby for a country.
Just a baby for
Interesting. But nevertheless, the expectations from that country, whatever the years that it has. And before we went for the break, Honorable John Ereso was on the mic, so we'll give him an opportunity to actually conclude his thoughts, and then we open up the discussion. Yes, Honorable Ereso.
now the point is, we have accepted that, maybe not accepted, I would be dictating. I have mentioned that private, what is it called?
Privatization.
No. Free market doesn't exist.
Free market
So,
economy.
The IMF and World Bank imposed free market conditions on us as conditions for making us get their assistance. We had no option. We had to accept it. For example, at the time, the Uganda police force was very weak. And we had problems in northern Uganda with the rebels. The IMF and World Bank refused that the Ugandan budget, mind you, at that time we did not have 5-year development plans. We had a 3-year rolling plan because we did not have resources. So it was only imperative that we had to go back to them for assistance, to support through budget support and all these others. And their condition was open the economy. Number 2, if you really want to settle your domestic issues, you don't use military force, you use policemen. Which policemen? We're weak.
Yes.
In other words, what I'm trying to bring here is that we had a situation where we had no option but to listen to them and accept their terms and do things according to them. Hence, our economy got derailed. That's the conclusion I want to make. And given that circumstances, even if we wrote a constitution operates against the backdrop of an economy. Our poverty, our wealth, our expectation and aspirations can only be achieved by our economic setting, so that our political tolerance and whatever it is could be upheld against that backdrop. Given that kind of delicate situation, therefore, the functions of our constitution was really equally affected.
And where does this put the statement that was made by President Yoweri Museveni that Uganda is unstoppable? Yet you say that our economy was completely crippled. Has there not been any change during the last 40 years of the NRM?
Yeah, certainly. I said earlier on that by the time Amin was removed, the growth of our GDP was negative 3%. Today it is not. I think we have moved some distance. As to whether we have moved this distance sufficiently enough to create impact is another question. As to whether we have moved this distance and it has created, it is sustainable is another question. As to whether we have moved this distance and it is sufficient to cause other changes to take place is another matter altogether. I think these are the challenges that we have. So if President Museveni said Uganda is unstoppable, it could probably be the determination that he has to make the country move forward against this backdrop.
All right.
And challenges.
Let's come to Dr. Jambo. Dr. Jambo, Honorable Eresu has dealt with the economic aspect and linked it up with the constitution. But one of the things that still bothers us now is the issue of governance. And when we got the constitution, we thought such things will be solved because of the history we had. The gentlemen and women sat in the Constituent Assembly, reflected on the challenges that we had, consulted widely, came up with a document that would solve these kind of situations. Where have we gone wrong, or where have we done well?
Yeah, thank you, Kenneth. This evening I'm really enjoying. I'm really enjoying that we have moved away from coming here to argue who is doing what, who is not doing this. We are really discussing matters that I just hope that people out there are listening and following, listening to Honorable there. It's good that is my OB from the University of Dar es Salaam, and that's how in Dar es Salaam we do things. Then listening, yes, then listening to my young brother here.
There is another OB of yours who has been in charge of the country for the last 40 years.
Yeah,
I don't know if you met him.
He wrote,
You
by
said
the
the
one
same.
of the best dissertations that you can read from the shelves in the University of Dar es Salaam.
Franz Fanon.
He was looking at Franz Fanon and
Franz Fanon.
The struggle of liberation in Africa. Having said that, you have had my young brother here asked me a question, which I want to begin from, then I lead you to the question of governance. He was asking me, what is the funny thing about this conflict between Prime Minister and President? It stems from where I started from. Africa was a country where each community governed themselves as a society, and a king, and a chief, and a clan leader, or something of that sort. Now, when colonialism came, it introduced the British, wanted to push a British system here. And you know, the British are a monarch, but which is a constitutional monarch, where you have the worker, the prime minister, and the king or queen, who is the leader. And the king only hands off and the eyes on. The prime minister must have hands on, eyes off. So we also got a problem when we got independence of American influence. And that's where the presidentialism came from. In America, they believe in a president. This was a new country. They didn't want kings. They didn't want anything. They wanted a president as the executive head. So for us, when we were getting independence, we tried to have a blend of two executives, and deceiving ourselves that the president would remain honorary and the other one would become executive. Remember, in Africa, the leader must have power. And what has been the problem is the power struggle between two executives who at the end of the day, as Honorable told us, that one could always look for a chance to usurp the power of the other one. And that's what always causes a problem. In the United States, they don't have a prime minister. And in Britain, they don't have a president. But for us, we want to have both in most cases. And since these are sources of power, and Africans have continued to live their life to an extent that they look at their leader to look like a chief, to look like a king. That's why you see, when you see President Museveni, he's not this executive head of a country. He thinks he's a king. And that's why he becomes uncomfortable when people start shouting here that there is this king, this king. So those ones have been called now in our constitution. No, they are called not even traditional leaders. They are called traditional institutions. So traditional institutions cannot even be led by a leader. They are just head of a traditional institution.
The institution is more powerful than the individual.
Yes. So coming back to your issue of governance, in 1986, just let me first begin from 1962. You cannot come here and tell people that Uganda has not moved. In fact, Obote used to describe it very well, the first prime minister of this country. Whenever he would be asked, he would say Uganda is moving, but is moving like a drunkard. 2 steps in front, 3 steps in front, 2 steps behind. It is staggering. So the country has been staggering. For those who have seen on a road when a drunkard is going back home, the way he staggers, that's how the country is staggering. Finally, the drunkard reaches where he stays, but he reaches with a lot of challenges. We have had a lot of challenges, but we have also had a lot of achievements. He lives in Zimbabwe. And there have been a lot of lies about Zimbabwe. The first time I went to Zimbabwe, I was amazed. I was really amazed. And that's why he even said that, do we get independence early? Wouldn't we would have delayed a little bit? But you know, in history, we don't have ifs. Things happen and they happen once. So one of the things that we have achieved, our people are now educated. They're educated. Whether they are learned is a different matter, but they have gone to school. We can speak English. We can have degrees, 1, 2, 3. We can have many things. We have helped and we have reached that level. I was looking at the statistics. Honorable Eresu, this country is a funniest country. The government schools only cater for primary 37%, for secondary 26% of the children. That's why when the teachers for government go to strike, UNEB is going to begin on Monday. So those poor kids who have not been studying in the village are going to do geography on Monday, whether they have been studying or not studying. And nobody is caring, not the president, not the minister of education, nobody in this country. The teachers have remained on strike. The people are going to work in their office. But what we forget is that our children are the ones who are getting stunted. Yours may be in the good school, may get a degree, but is going to lose his or her head by this person who a teacher has not been teaching. So we have been moving in education. Infrastructure, the president tells you that when they came here, there was only 1,000 kilometers tarmac. Now we are about 7,000. Haven't we moved? We have moved. If you came to Kampala, the storied buildings, even me when I came to Kampala the first time in 1997, you would stand and see storied buildings in Kampala. You would see Crested Towers, you would see Uganda House, you would see a few. But there are very many that have come up. Whose buildings are they, whether they are for Ugandans or not for Ugandans? That's what they call in economics growth. But we need to interrogate, is it development? I don't know. When you talk about certain things like the country coming together, are we together? What he was calling a nation is still problematic. Now let's go to the constitution. I think people should not shy that this constitution was a good idea. I think so. It was a good idea. And I normally divide it into about 4 or 5 pillars. The first pillar was the people of Uganda. And that's why in the first article, they said that power belongs to the people who shall exercise that power in accordance with the Constitution. What they
and by the way, that is the whole Constitution.
But what
the rest are explanations of expansion of that statement.
That has since been amended. That has since been amended, only that they have not put the amendments in the book. Now, power belongs to those who have guns and shall be exercised according to the president, the commander-in-chief. So that is the only problem. That amendment, I really request MPs to go and put it in the constitution so that we get to know. Because the practice, that's what we see. Then, the other thing of the constitution was mainly on how do people govern themselves. And they argued that people will govern themselves in many ways. And one of the major way was under decentralized arrangements. And everybody praised Uganda. Everybody came here to benchmark Uganda, to see how Uganda has succeeded in decentralization. And that decentralization, for example, when you look at Kenya, Kenya benchmarked us and went and also did decentralization recently in their constitution of 2010, and they formed the counties. They are fantastic. If you go to Kenya and see what the counties are doing, fantastic. When you come to Uganda and see what the districts are doing, shambolic. So the problem was we gave districts, we gave sub-counties, we gave LOCs power, but full of a shell of power. They have a shell, like you give somebody an eggshell. For us who grew up in the village, the snake used to be one of the best consumer of the egg. Would come and put a very small hole on the egg and suck all the liquid in the egg and leave it there. So when you pick it, you think you have found an egg. That is the decentralization that we got. To an extent, I normally wonder, what is the role of LC5 and his council at the district? They don't have a budget other than paying salaries. They don't have any development fund. The development fund, a little of it goes to the sub-county. But even it is too small to do anything meaningful. Maybe to construct pit latrines and small things there. A sub-county cannot construct a 1 kilometer tarmacked road in Uganda. If there is any sub-county, maybe divisions in Kampala, maybe can try. But my sub-county is down there. There is no sub-county that has money that can construct a 1 kilometer tarmacked road. So decentralization there is not useful. Then the other thing that constitution had looked at was how do you get your leaders? And you asked me the question of governance. They put in place a very cumbersome process of elections. In fact, Uganda has a very high per capita leaders, political leaders, than any country. Right now, we are close to 3 million elected leaders, from LOC1 to the president. But when you look at what do these leaders do, these elected leaders, LOC5 and his council, LC3 and his council, I don't know which one, what do they do? Nothing. Nothing. They are just disturbing people here. We have a public service which is about 464,000 people. We have filled about 367. Thereabout, a few people die and leave. But they are being supervised by 3 million politicians. The people who are working are 300,000. But the people who are supervising them, 3 million. What a country. So that constitution helped us to deal with the issue of governance, but they were not very sure on how it will be done. Now, what have politicians come to do in Uganda? In most cases, I look at politicians like people who go for beauty contest. You know, when I was at the university, I attended Miss Tourism. There was a Miss Tourism thing. So I asked myself, when I get out as a very beautiful girl, so what? They have declared you that you are the Miss Tourism, Miss Kampala, Miss Uganda. So what? So majority of these leaders, Lord Mayor, LOC5, and others are like Miss Tourism, Miss Uganda. After they have come out, what do they do? Nothing. So we need, I think, to go back and look at, we overturn this thing. We get 3 million people working, supervised by a few Miss Ugandans who can come and threaten and do a few things, including even the top notch. I don't want to mention their name because I'm on a public radio. They also look like Miss Uganda. So in my view, the Constitution came up with some good things. When you look at the Bill of Rights, it is one of the best in not only in Africa, but in the world. Chapter 4 of our Constitution. If you are a reader, it just looks like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But who was there to implement it? Who was there to safeguard against those human rights? Human rights can only succeed in a country where there is civic competence, where people must know their rights, because they are the ones who should complain about their rights. In Uganda, civic competence is tending to zero. Some up to today people ask you, but why is Museveni campaigning again? What has happened? Why doesn't he just continue? And I tend to agree with them. In Uganda, for example, elections are a show. Like, for example, why don't we elect on Monday? Because me, I know who will become the president.
All right. Yes. Mr. Karamaji, let's hear you on the issue of governance, and then we come to Mr. Chemonges before we go for a break, and then reflect on the issues that Ugandans will have put forward in their comments.
Sure.
Where did we go wrong, Mr. Karamagi, when it comes to issues of governance?
Yes, I'd like to introduce a word or a phrase into this discussion, which is that our Constitution is observed in violation. That sounds like it's I know it's an oxymoron. It's a statement that contradicts itself, but I'll speak a bit more to it, and then we can. So we've never sat down to agree in whichever council of state or government or parliament that torture, abduction, extrajudicial killings, disrespect of court orders is something that we should do. It is actually fact that what has been recommended by successive commissions, constitutional making bodies, is that we should respect the right to life, the right to property, privacy, that certain rights are inalienable, and so on and so forth. Yet, in practice, we violate those very things and then quote what the situation should be, but after violating what we've committed to. The brilliant Ugandans like Dr. Jambo should help us understand what it is with human nature that, whether it's the political culture or there's something defective in the legal legislative process. The second thing I'd like to talk about, for me, regarding governance, is a concept that has been introduced into our jurisprudence by the Supreme Court in a previous presidential election petition, which is called the basic structure doctrine. So I'm not one of those lawyers who wants to use Latin maxims to dazzle the public and excite people without them understanding. So I'll use an analogy that people can relate to, non-lawyers can relate to. And that analogy is one of a sweater. Remember your childhood sweater, the one that you wore in school. Once in a while, you would find a string loose. One of the threads has come out. And the temptation as a child would be to pull, thinking that once I pull out this one and break it, the sweater will be fine. But strangely, as you pull on or tug on a string in the side of the sweater that has your arm, you notice that it's the collar that's getting creased. So the sweater is made as a whole. You cannot pull one string and without affecting the integrity of the entire fabric of that sweater. So let's bring this example to the Constitution. You cannot extract certain clauses. One of them, the First Amendment, the increase of ministers beyond 21 within a year of the Constitution being made, which is something that is not talked about a lot in our Ugandan political discussions, but that was a fundamental departure from what the Constitution had recommended. A few years later, I was in primary 2 when this document was passed. Now I'm here debating the same thing. A few years later, the term limit, and this is for me the core, which I'll end with for now. This Constitution presumed that if we give someone 10 years, if you're bad, you will go after 10 years. If you're good, you should be able to deliver within those 10. It did not presume a 40-year incumbency. It presumed only 10 years. So the power, the level of power that was invested in the presidency was on the understanding that this, you'll only enjoy this for a maximum of 10 years, minimum 5, and you go. A crisis, this is my last sentence, Anderson. The crisis that we now have in one of the in one of the three arms is that the entire bench, the judicial branch in Uganda, from magistrates all the way to their lordships in the Supreme Court, has been appointed by one person. So that string, remember my analogy, you pull on term limits thinking you're doing it for yourself, but you end up affecting the judicial function. You take out the age limit, you begin crowding the queue, because let's use the word queue, which is popular in Ugandan politics. General Museveni's leadership or generation should have handed over, let's say, in 2005 or 6. Honorable Eresu here should have taken over with his colleagues from that point. Perhaps now we would have my elder brother here, Chimonges, and Dr. Ojambo in government, and then in 2031 you hand over to the Karamajis. But we now have a traffic, if I can use the word, a traffic jam of ambitions, of technology, of different aspirations, and you've blocked expression with the Computer Misuse Act, you've put the Public Order Management Act, you've put anti-money laundering, you've put all these laws to try and suppress.
No demonstration in the urban areas.
No nothing. So you're piling up all these generations and ambitions and talent and all these things, which then defeats the very purpose of why you have a constitution. So for me, basic structure, Anderson, the question of observing our laws in violation, which has brought us to where we are today.
All right, Spectrum Xtra on Radio 1 FM 90. Let's go for a break now. When we return, we'll bring in Mr. Chimonges and also get the views of the listeners and then sum up this discussion with a way forward for our country. Stay tuned, Radio 1 FM 90. We continue after this break. Thank you so much for staying with us on Spectrum Xtra, live on Radio 1 FM 90. Special edition of our 63 years of independence. Honorable John Eresu, Mr. Andrew Karamaji, Dr. Robert Ojambo, and Mr. Thomas Chimonges. We appreciate the views that you have sent in already on WhatsApp. In a short while, I'll be reading out some of them, but we need to bring in the views of Mr. Chimonges on the issues of governance to try and understand where we are now as a country and what he thinks can be done to actually address some of the outstanding challenges, the issues that we thought the Constitution had addressed but have kept on cropping up. Mr. Chimonges.
Thank you, Anderson. Today we had a second conference on Constitution convened to bring like-minded organizations and individuals to discuss the state of our country, specifically as we commemorate the 63 years of independence. And we had quite distinguished individuals who were members of who participated in this conference, and I saw Karamaji, I saw Dr. Ojambo, and we had and when you listen to the different voices in the room, is that there is consensus that there is a fundamental problem where we are at today as a country, and that you could also read some level of frustration in the room, and there seemed not to be much about the way forward, about what do we do. Some of the key speakers today we had was, Justice Okola, we had Professor Frederick Sempebwa and Justice Krigler from South Africa. And there was a proper analysis of the past, the challenges that we are facing today. But what the future looks like still remain to be unclear. And I think that listening to the different voices, and even those of us who are in the table here, you see that while the country is grappling with these so much aspirations as aggregated within the legal frameworks we have, that is in the 1995 Constitution, the country seems to be in a place of a capture, where all seems to start and end with an individual. Earlier, Honorable highlighted the fact that governance is premised on goodwill. Sometimes goodwill of those who are governed and those who are being governed. And I thought maybe I had a different view on that. That sometimes if you premise the governance of the country on an individual to be determined by the goodwill of this individual, sometimes it becomes very unclear and very unpredictable. And probably I think that despite the discussions and all the negotiations that could have happened during the constitutional making process in 1995 in CA, I think there was so much trust by the Constituent Assembly that the individuals who would implement this constitution would be people who would run on the goodwill. Unfortunately, I think that sometimes as human beings, man is selfish. The desire to always acquire more sometimes creeps in. And if that is not regulated by systems, by legal frameworks, it can stretch because of the human desires, human selfishness, and all the other things. And I think that where we are today is a clear testament of what the challenges that some of the CA members had envisaged is happening. That all power is centered on an individual. As Karamaki says, you see that the judiciary, the appointments are predominantly determined by the head of state. It means that it's a whole arm of government that is properly under capture. The same thing probably with parliament, where today we seem not to have a very clear line between the executive and the legislature, which means that it gives the executive a leeway to have their way at all times. Yet it remains to be a very critical institution that was supposed to check but also support the executive to implement the aspirations of the people as envisaged within the 1995 Constitution. And so I think that the dilemma we are at today is the discussion is centered around an individual. And even as we move towards the general election, it still remains within the individual who is now the president. I saw the president, of course, issuing threats to the art teachers who are currently on strikes of their demands for increase of salaries, and it kept me wondering. And probably that was a clear manifestation for me of lack of proper systems. And when asked, what is your plan for a transition in this country? I think President Museveni has been asked those in the recent past, I think in the last 1 month, asked, what is your plan for the question of transition in this country? The other was in Kololo, and it deviated the discussion to socioeconomic development and many other things. Recently, I think it was yesterday or the other day, while he was addressing the media and asked the same question, he seemed to also deflect it to the fact that it's already provided within the law.
Legal framework.
And that is the only option we have. Yet we all recognize that the elections which we have in the country is simply legitimizing a process. That the outcomes of these elections are clearly predetermined. You can clearly know, as you saw what Dr. Jambo says, that probably knows the next
president
of the country, which places us in a very unique state. That transition should be predictable, but also the future of the country should be placed within the aspiration of its people. Whether the current system is reflective of what the people looks like, I think your answer is as good as mine. But I think that there's a fundamental problem. As we move forward, for me, I think that there is need for us to look more towards working through the systems, but also having the citizens' agency given back to the people. Because I also think that the other day when I listened to the Minister of Justice and Constitutional Affairs, Honorable Mao, giving remarks around the upcoming general elections. And you know, the Minister of Justice is the supervisor of the Electoral Commission and provides that oversight. The minister says that clearly the outcome and the transition question of this country cannot be realized through elections, which may be an opinion that can be considered on the table. But given his mandate and given his position, I think that there is need for him to promote and be seen,
All right.
to aggregate what the people aspired in the 1995 Constitution, which places us in a place where you have an executive that has gone rogue, you have a legislature that has given up, but also you have the judiciary that is hoping for the better. And so the country is in a state of a quagmire.
All right. Now we need to go to the listener and pick some of the views that have come in during the course of this discussion so that we can understand exactly what do Ugandans think about the future of this country. And the comments have been coming in via the WhatsApp line 0703-090-090. And we begin with this comment from Kauma Degule in Mitiana, who says, I don't agree that the 1964 referendum triggered the 1966 crisis. The crisis was triggered by a lifestyle audit. Parliament had audited Obote and Amin. It found them guilty because they had amassed unexplained wealth. To escape punishment, Obote and Amin mounted a coup and overthrew the independence constitution. Then we have another comment coming in from Akama Emmanuel, listening in from Mukono municipality, says it's really good to have historians, not just those who know history, but those who have witnessed it. What the country was back in the days, and even the other countries, African countries in general, before getting their independence, have been aided by whites up to now. Long most of them got independence, are still getting aid from the same whites. There is no big reason African countries, Uganda particular, sought for independence, yet we are still vulnerable to the whites due to our bad governance, characterized by the opposition, by corruption, and there are no big gains to be celebrated except life for those who are still alive. Then we have a comment that comes in from Regina, who says, how do we address our governance problems? We seem to be going in circles given what the listeners have actually put across. Then we have another comment coming in from Richard, who is asking, can the transition in Uganda be negotiated like Minister of Constitutional Affairs Norbert Mao hinted? Then we have this comment that comes in from Susan, who says, Parliament is a critical agency in the governance system. Can it step up and play its critical role to ensure that laws that are required to ensure a smooth transition of power in the country are worked on, and that the executive is held to account, not to abrogate the constitution? Well, that's some of the feedback, some of the issues that are coming across. And I want to begin with you, Honorable Eresu, with a quick response, and then we go around the table.
I wanted to say this. There was a mention which has been put here that the Ugandans have become inept. They don't question their rights. They don't have self-determination to call government to order. You see, when we wrote the Constitution, there was an article, and there is an Article 17, Clause 2. Article 17, Clause 2 was a deliberate article. And in that article, we had said every Ugandan must be trained physically, of course, militarily, and must do national service. And there must be civic education so that people's consciousness are awakened. Why did that article come? That article came because here was a country which had gone through turmoil. How best can we ignite their sense of ownership of this country? Unfortunately, that thing has not been implemented to the expectations of what the dictate of that article would have required. I think that is one unfortunate thing in our constitution, that the lack of implementation of Article 17, Clause 2 is partly responsible for the problems that we have today about our governance. Because in situations where such things exist, the level of political consciousness rises. And therefore, it also influences how we choose our leaders and how our leaders handle our affairs. Personally, I was very excited when that article was adopted, and I've all along been expecting it to be implemented. It is very critical. Because how else would we have brought Ugandans to a level of this kind of ownership of their country? After that experience we had of the 1966 crisis, the Idi Amin regime, the times when we had UNLF and so on, the guerrilla warfare of NRA, and generally the divisions and factionalization of the country which we had entered. If we did not have a uniting factor through bringing Ugandans together to activate their sense of consciousness of ownership of their country. I think that is one serious problem which we omitted in our constitution, for which I think we are having some problems thereof. The other thing I also want to bring when we're writing the constitution, why I say there is goodwill. The Constituent Assembly delegates had a lot of goodwill for this country. And since the convening of the Constituent Assembly was a result of a deliberate government effort, that was goodwill in itself. And that goodwill should not have been abused or doubted, because they had constituted the country into discussion, into a dialogue. And that dialogue charted a new direction by creating a constitution. So the delegates of the Constituent Assembly, therefore, maybe save for those who are no longer there, maybe they are also thinking that what could they have done? Could they have invented something of suspicion when there was no ground for it? There was no reason. And that's why goodwill remains what I mentioned as something which should be prevalent in any governance structure. I want to say this, but we cannot entirely blame everybody, I mean, even those in government, for what has happened. I think circumstances along the way might have played part, and they're also victims of the whole process. How? You see, this country, after the proclamation of the Constitution, remained with the insurgencies. And those insurgencies were actually challenges to the status quo at that time. And therefore, it was imperative for the state at that time to reestablish itself by suppressing those insurgencies. In fact, we still have insurgency with ADF.
ADF.
Yeah. So, in such circumstances, there is a propensity for those in positions to overtly act in certain manners. But it would only remain reasonable for them to check themselves. And that would mean we should have a parliament which sets the executive to be accountable. But in the absence of a parliament which is not very checking to the executive to be accountable, there we go.
All right, more comments coming in from the listeners, and I want also to read them out. so that we can quickly have a response. Good evening, Spectrum. Mr. Karamaji's analogy of a sweater being damaged by a loose string is very fitting to the 1995 Constitution of Uganda. This has been done deliberately. Maybe another document is being drafted to replace this one. That's a comment from George Washington, who is listening in from Wakiso. Lumbuye Lawrence at Zigoti writes in and says, history is just repeating itself. Remember and compare Governor Frederick Crawford directives in 1957 and the Public Order Management Bill. We have failed to learn from the past mistakes. That's why the pillars of the 1995 Constitution were amended. Baseline is the goodwill of our leaders and conceiving Uganda to be a greater and bigger than any one of us. That's Lumbuye Lawrence at Zigoti. Professor Talwana, listening in from Kasanga, today talk would make a beautiful reading in the form of a book. I wish the panelists would think of publishing their analysis for Hasnan historians to read. I can tell you I'm in a lecture room today and I'm enjoying every bit of it. Kamogo Fred Keta writes in from Kira municipality, and he says the word independence is defined under a broader perspective, including but not limited to economic, political, and social aspects. However, in Uganda, it's difficult to define using the above. If economically we can't finance our local budget by 60%, don't have bigger fraction in terms of air transport, among others, forget about independence, we are still global economic slaves, for lack of better words. 2, on governance levels, the constitution framers had a good intentions, but the implementers have only misused it to benefit their selfish interests. If it had been respected, Uganda today would have been different, politically, economically, and maybe socially. The fusion of the 3 arms of government without separation of power is basically Uganda's political conundrum. That's Kamogo Fred Keta in Kira municipality. Turia Agenda writes and says, one of the panelists touched enough when he stated that as an economist, he believes there is no such a thing as a free market. The core problem, however, is that a large number of government employees are economists who apply purely theoretical principles to solve real life governance issues. These economists often see themselves as the alpha and omega, the planners, the consultants, they're everything in the government. This is what is known as professional imperialism. If we do not open our eyes, these theories may be taking us in the right direction, but at the wrong speed. This is why in our national development plans, NDP 1 to 3, we see little tangible change, progress, just xeroxing and moving like a drunkard. 2 steps forward, 1 step backward. That's a comment from Turia Agenda. Let me come to you, Mr. Andrew Karamaji, in 2 minutes.
Sure. So we were talking about institutions here, and what came into mind is something that has circulated on social media. A poster by one of the statutory authorities of Uganda in charge of the environment, putting out a post saying, our achievements, an Independence Day post saying, our achievements under the NRM manifesto. This is a statutory authority publishing and aligning itself to the ruling party, if you want to use those words.
I'll tell you they're implementing the manifesto of the ruling party, so to them, there's nothing wrong.
But under the plan of Uganda.
You know, so those contradictions like those. But there's something that I am so passionate about and which disturbs me. And because I grew up reading a lot of General Museveni's works and biographies by those with whom he shot his way to power, I remember reading something by him about his days in the arts club or theater club of Ntare, one of the schools that he went to.
Way after Julius Caesar.
Yes. It's clear, and this is, I hate to say this, but I have to say that how our leaders use their knowledge to mislead those who are not as attentive to what is happening. I am certain that General Museveni knows that the root of science is art. If you think about people like Michelangelo, you know, look, we have a celebrated judge called Lord Denning. He was first a mathematician and then came to an arts field. It is impossible to separate art and science, or science from art. The two are so intertwined that this distinction between teachers of humanities and teachers of sciences is disingenuous and absurd that an entire country can engage in a debate on who between an arts teacher or a science teacher is better than the other.
I don't know.
That's something that And finally, a listener commented and talked about negotiated transition. I am of the considered view that a negotiation succeeds where, forgive these words, Anderson, where there is a balance of terror, or otherwise known as the mutually assured destruction, the threat of mutually assured destruction. The apartheid regime in South Africa conceded to negotiations, CODESA negotiations, to end apartheid because Umkhonto we Sizwe, Inkatha Freedom Party and others had shown that, guys, the cost of maintaining this thing is going to be so high, we're ready to drive up the cost. De Klerk was weakened and agreed to a negotiated settlement. We Ugandans, particularly those in my generation and younger, must come to a place where we raise the cost of continued incumbency and repression so that we can have a negotiation on equal terms. Only then can we correct our political culture, which has gone to the dogs. Thank you.
Samson Raisina says, time has caught up with the malicious lies which claim that Dr. Obote and Idi Amin had amassed wealth from Congolese gold. If so, then the Obote and Amin families will be very rich. John Bijemano in Bweyogerere, John Bijemano used to host this show. He writes in and says, Ugandans can never be truly independent until institutions of the independent state are truly independent. Why do Ugandan judges continue to wear the silly wigs of British counterparts? What value do the wigs add to the administration of justice in this country? Chemonges.
Thank you, Anderson, and thanks to the listeners as they for the comments, for their reflections. For me, I want to end by saying that I think as a country there is recognizing that we have only one country. It means that all our efforts must be concentrated in saving or salvaging this specific country. And that, I think, can only be realized through ensuring that the question of citizens' agency is strengthened through the provision, of course, of information, continued awareness, but also ensuring that the people can meaningfully participate in this process. I think that one of the strategies that has been successfully implemented is to reduce the amount of information, the amount of knowledge that goes to the people. The other day I was in the village and coming from Kapchora, I noticed that the ruling party seems to be dominant. Now, whereas that is true from the face value, there's been a significant restriction of the opposition from accessing the people.
In Kapchora?
Not necessarily in Kapchora,
other places.
For the better part of the country, which has increased the price of the ruling party and suppressed those of the others.
All right. Very quickly, we'll have Dr. Ojambo giving us his closing remarks.
Anderson, there are two issues here which were raised, which I noted. One of them was negotiated transition. My young brothers dealt with that very fantastically. I want to go to the issue of distorted history in this country. There are people who read only the part they like in the whole script of history. But for us who read history, we talk about coherence. There must be coherence in what you read from the beginning to the end. Don't just jump on the issue. Somebody was talking here about the life audit which was raised in Parliament by Daud Ocheng. Daud Ocheng had been incorporated into Kabaka Yeka group. This was a man from Lango, but because of studying in Budo, from Acholi, and studying in Budo, a friend of the king, he had become a Kabaka Yeka person. Somebody should be curious why he was the one raising the motion of life audit in 1966 about the gold scandal. It was